May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen. Amen.
Some years ago, I was a bit younger. A friend of mine, I always loved to sail, and a friend of mine had a boat, and oftentimes I would go with him when he went sailing offshore, out in the sea. And he would ask me to come along because I was sort of known as a navigator, able to find where we were going. It's strange because my wife would never understand that today, but I digress. But one time we went out and got on his boat in St. Petersburg, Florida, and our trip was to sail around Florida and off to Marsh Harbor in the Bahamas. So St. Pete's on the western side, so we had to go all the way around Florida. And as we were heading around, as nighttime came, and even before night, the wind came up and up and up and blew. It blew so hard that it actually, we were in it's a sailboat, and we couldn't make way. We couldn't sail close enough to the wind to make our way on our course, and it was blowing us off the shore out into the Gulf. And the waves were huge. It was a 62-foot sailboat. It's a big boat with a very tall mast. And the waves rose as high as the spreaders on the mast, where the cables came down to hold the mast up. And the waves would crash into the boat, and it would actually fill the cockpit of the boat with water. Of course, the cockpit was self-bailing, the water ran out. And we all had on harnesses with ropes that we clicked onto the lifeline stanchions so we wouldn't be washed overboard. I'll tell you one thing, I would not have gotten out of that boat. I would not have gotten out of that boat. Somehow, though, I think there was just three of us, and I think we felt a kind of peace in the midst of that storm. At least I know I did. And as looking back, I don't think I credited God or Christ or Jesus with that peace, but of course that's what it was. Just confidence. I'll never forget it. So these boat stories in the Gospels, there's one in each Gospel, all four Gospels, and they're all a little bit different in certain ways. The one in Mark, they cried out to Jesus and he came to them. He was walking on the water and they thought it was a ghost. And he said, "Take heart, do not be afraid." And then he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. And it says, interestingly enough, it says, as he was walking on the sea, he intended to pass them by. Isn't that interesting? But immediately, when they heard them call, he came to them. So Christ really, in this case, doesn't intervene. He left them to sort it all out by themselves until they called for him, and he came. In Luke, nobody walks on the water. He's in the boat, sleeping in the boat. They have to go back and wake him up. He says, "Why are you afraid?" And he calms the sea. Again, Jesus right there with them, waiting to step in when called on. But not jumping up and intervening. He's asleep in the boat. That's interesting. In St. John, it's a little bit different too. His disciples are in a boat. They got into the boat, started to cross. They're headed for Capernaum. It was dark, and it says Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea became strong as wind. When they had rowed about 4 miles, it said they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat. But immediately, before they could even do that, the boat reached the land which they were going, Capernaum. It's an interesting twist on it, actually, but St. John writes really of the post-resurrection Christ. It was kind of a different appearance. The appearances that the disciples and others saw in the aftermath of the resurrection sounded more like that. But they wanted to take him into the boat. But Christ had already seen them safely to Capernaum. Today, the stories tend to want to reassure you and me that Christ is there for us in our times of trial, in the storms of life, in the winds of COVID. I think about it, I always think of the old fisherman's prayer. "Oh God, thy sea is so great and my boat is so small." The Matthew story, though, that I had just read has that one unique feature. Peter decides to get out of the boat. You know, it takes a lot of courage to get out of the boat and step out into that storm. And the one overarching theme of all of this, I think, of all the stories and all the gospel, is faith and trust in Christ. So let's think metaphorically a little bit about these stories. What does it represent? What does the boat represent? The wind and the waves and the storms, to me, represent all the chaos of life that we live in. And in some ways of looking at the boat can be seen as the church, where we come in safety, we hope. A safe container in the midst of the storm that rages around us. Or the boat could be the prison from which we long to escape. If you're someone who suffers from seasickness, you will understand that metaphor. Because some folks would rather get out and jump into the sea than continue to endure that seasickness. I'm lucky on that, but I've seen others suffer. Sometimes we're absolutely so miserable in life, in the boat of life, that we would rather choose the storm around us than to stay where we are. Like an intolerable situation at a job that we seemingly cannot do without, and we cannot escape from this job for all the reasons that we have jobs. Or maybe an abusive or toxic relationship at home that somehow seems unescapable. Or an addiction that has an iron grip on our lives. I wonder what actually compelled Peter to step out of the boat, seeking the arms of Jesus out in that storm. It's interesting to contemplate. There was a lot going on for those disciples in that time. A lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 12-step programs. I know a lot about 12-step programs. Many people know that they were conceived by a man named Bill W. and Dr. Bob, two men in the 1930s. And it's worthy to comment that an Episcopal priest named Sam Shoemaker had a whole lot to do with the spiritual development within the 12 steps as they were being, of that whole program as it was being developed. And today, the essence of that program has been adopted by so many groups, so many diverse groups of all kinds, trying to help people who's found themselves trapped in a rocking or sinking boat of addiction. For me, the first 3 steps were the most transforming. Step 1 is that we admit that we are in a horrible rocking boat in the middle of a sea, and we're powerless over the whole thing. And we're powerless over that which we're addicted to. That our lives have become totally unmanageable. And this goes really far beyond just alcohol. There's so many things to be addicted to. I think sometimes, I think about St. Paul when he talks about the cravings of our body. There's even I've heard of a 12-step group that this kind of focuses on our addiction to our self. Step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. This is where I have to decide what I really believe about God. When one comes to the 12-step program, that's really the hardest thing to do, I think. What do you really believe about God? In this setting of an AA or an NA or whatever A, one kind of sets aside the doctrine of discipline of the church. For me, it took me behind the trappings of the church. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, you know that. It took me behind all of that to where God really is. All we do here is just a window to that. It's just a window to a power greater than ourselves that could restore us to sanity. Faith was challenged when one moves on to the next step, 3. People come to 12-step with all kinds of relationships with God or no relationships with God at all. But step 3 says, make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. Let go, let God is what the little cliche is. That is a challenge. So I'll tell you a little story about that. We need a little humor right here. So the story's about a fellow that was climbing and hiking and kind of in the mountains, and he slipped and fell off this sheer cliff. And just as he was falling down off the cliff, there's a little tree, a little branch that's kind of sticking out of the cliff, and he grabs hold of that that branch. But there's nowhere to go, up or down. He's just stuck there, hanging onto that branch. And so he looks up and he says, God, help me. And a voice comes down and says, let go of the branch. He says, God, help me. Let go of the branch. And he says, is there anybody else up there? But you know what? That's kind of what it's like. Let go. Let God take over. As I said, the one overarching theme of all these stories in all the gospel is faith and trust. But if you get there, the steps don't end there. We don't just turn our life over to God and sit back and wait and see what's going to happen. There's a lot of hard work to do in the 12-step, 9 more steps, and they're not easy. But none compared to those first 3. Admit you're stuck in the boat. Admit that Christ can take care of it, take care of you, reorder your life. So going forward, the tasks are sort of like it's reflection and confession and reconciliation. And at the end, at the 12th step, is helping others in the same boat. All adopting a new way of living in grace. When all seems too much to bear, we can call on Jesus over the tumult of the sea. Check and see if he might be asleep in the back of your boat. Wake him up. He's there for you. If it all seems lost, get out of the boat and walk with Christ above the waves of the storm. So there's a very familiar little prayer. It's called the Serenity Prayer. It comes from a longer prayer written by Reinhold Niebuhr, a theologian. I just wanted to read you the original text of that prayer. It's not often heard. And it doesn't sound quite the same as the familiar. It goes like this. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed. Courage to change the things which should be changed. And the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you, God, will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.